Canada is a great country, but for many Black Canadians, it has yet to achieve its full potential. That stark truth comes from a statement made by the Parliamentary Black Caucus calling on all levels of government to dismantle systemic racism in this country. Among the calls to action are justice reforms, changes to policing, diversifying the public service, and specifically to follow through on a promise Justin Trudeau made when he was first elected in 2015 to end mandatory minimum sentences. Will that happen? To discuss all that, Matthew Green, an NDP MP and a member of the Parliamentary Black Caucus, is here. And we've also have the former Justice Minister and Independent MP, Jody Wilson-Raybould. First of all, good to see both of you, and I hope you and your loved ones are well. I'll start with you, Mr. Green. Calls to tackle systemic racism, obviously, they're long overdue, echoing across the world and this country in the wake of the George Floyd situation, tragedy. What specifically would you and the caucus like to see change here in Canada?
Well, I think what we're hearing is a real conversation on the framing of public safety and what that means for communities. Exactly who are we keeping safe? You only have to look, you don't have to go to the South. You can look right here to instances of horrific and violent brutality against both Black and Indigenous communities here. We are echoing the calls of the Black Lives Matter movement, which looks at defunding and reprioritizing investments into the social determinants of health. We know that police budgets continue to balloon across the country, while simultaneously the quality of life for people is certainly not being improved.
It is remarkable, as many commentators have pointed out. Never calls to decrease funding for police, but often decreasing funding for other things like healthcare and education. An end to mandatory minimum sentences has been a big part of the call. I'm going to go to Jody Wilson-Raybould on that. The Prime Minister said today that's not off the table, but Jody Wilson-Raybould, you had already advocated for that when you were the Justice Minister and it didn't happen. Why is that so important to happen, and what has delayed that?
Well, I mean, depends on who you ask what the answers would be in terms of why the delay. But I mean, I 100% support Matthew Green and the Black Parliamentary Caucus and all the allies that signed on in terms of what needs to be done for justice and policing, specifically with respect to mandatory minimum penalties. It has been proven time and again, expert panel reports, discussions among attorneys general, that mandatory minimum penalties are a direct cause of the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples and other marginalized Canadians in the criminal justice system. They do not enable judges to exercise the necessary discretion that they should be able to when sentencing individuals that come before them. It was a promise of this government in 2015, and it is something that I asked about yesterday in the parliamentary committee. It's something that needs to happen, and repealing mandatory minimum penalties is something that I will continue to press for.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to bring back Mr. Green for a second because there's a number of other items in this statement. One of them is police reform. At a federal level, what needs to happen there?
Well, we've called time and time again for the automatic and immediate banning of the use of carding or street checks or racial profiling for all federal institutions that we have oversight over. And we're also extending that call to municipal levels of government. Of course, that's something that can happen right now. If you look at our ability to provide transparency, we have called for the release of all incidents of use of force. There appears to be an ongoing racial amnesia in this country, where every time an instance of police brutality against Indigenous or Black people, we have to start the conversation with, does racism exist? We know that it exists. Right. We want to see it quantified. And we also want to have a release of all of the costs for the civil settlements that are coming out of police misconduct.
And that's, by the way, that's absolutely a profound point. Why we have to start on first base every time these events happen is a mystery to many people. Jody Wilson-Raybould, in Nunavut, the Court of Appeal actually ruled to uphold mandatory minimums, citing protections for Indigenous women. A lot of people don't get that. Are mandatory minimums beneficial in some scenarios? Oh, we've lost Jody. I'm going to come back to Jody Wilson-Raybould on that. Jody,
may I add just an aspect to the
Matthew Green, go ahead. We'll reestablish with Jody, but go ahead, Matthew.
because that has caused some consternation in terms of who, ought to be provided the ability for de-incarceration. It's one of our calls. I'd like to put particular focus on cannabis amnesty. If you look at a time during legalization when the major corporations, the major Bay Street blue chip stocks that are out there, these are populated by people, former law enforcement, former Hill staffers, politicos, people with partisan ties, while simultaneously Black and Indigenous populations remain incarcerated for nonviolent cannabis offenses. And of course, there's an ongoing conversation around decriminalizing drugs and recognizing that the war on drugs is a failed war. And so we've locked people up. We have criminalized mental health. We have criminalized addictions. Of course, these are not just unique to the Black Indigenous populations, but they have a profound and disproportionate impact on the sentencing, on the length of sentencing, and of course, the fact that we still have people in jail to this day on cannabis, nonviolent cannabis offenses, I think is highly hypocritical when we see the types of people who are involved in the profiteering off of cannabis.
I think we got Jody back, Mr. Green, just hanging
Sorry,
on there. Jody Wilson-Raybould, I don't know if you heard the question, but the Nunavut Court of Appeal ruled to uphold mandatory minimums. They say they protect Indigenous women. A lot of people are worried about that. Are mandatory minimums, are they beneficial in some scenarios?
Well, I mean, as a general principle, I believe fundamentally that judges need to have the discretion to approach, to look at sentencing based on the individual that is before them. There are different circumstances. Mandatory minimum penalties have been discussed for a long time. As I said, the Supreme Court of Canada has weighed in and rendered many mandatory minimum penalties unconstitutional. I think the point and what is of prime importance is to ensure that we enable judges to exercise the necessary discretion and take into account the circumstances of the convicted person before them, whether or not they have mental health and addictions issues, whether they come from an Indigenous background and are suffering from the ongoing legacy of the colonial reality. There's many circumstances that lead individuals into the criminal justice system, and our system needs to reform to be not just hard on crime. I think we need to be, as President Obama has said and many others, we need to be smart on crime and, engage in really good public policy discussions and be open to Canadians about why we're making decisions and why mandatory minimum penalties need to be repealed.
Right, and just so people know, we do have something in the Gladue report, the Gladue principle in law that does take into that account. For now, the question is, does that get expanded?
I should state that is one of our points to invest in the restorative justice programs and community-grounded initiatives. We know that to be true. We have seen the ability for pre-sentencing reports, for adjustments on sentencing based on Gladue, and part of our recommendations is to look at how that can be applied to Black, Brown, and other racialized Canadians who are overrepresented. The other aspect that we're calling for is to provide supplementary legal aid for individuals, because this is also a question about who can afford the access to representation.
I would just add on.
Go ahead real quick, Jody.
Just add on to what Matthew was saying. I mean, we actually need to ensure as Canadians that we make the case to the governments to invest the necessary dollars and think beyond election periods and do what is right that will show and reap rewards down the line as we take care of the most vulnerable among us.
Absolutely.
Jody Wilson-Raybould and Mr. Green, great to have both of you. These are absolutely critical.